What does it mean to be indigenous? Well, like with most of these discussions, let's start with a dictionary definition and then work our way down into the details from there. Here's Merriam-Webster's first definition: produced, growing, living, or occurring natively or naturally in a particular region or environment. A secondary definition related to the first one is of or relating to the earliest known inhabitants of a place, and especially of a place that was colonized by a now dominant group. In progressive speak, indigenous seems to exclusively refer to the earliest inhabitants of a place that has historically been colonized to the point that their civilizations have been entirely destroyed, like the indigenous peoples of Canada, the United States, and Australia. For the majority of the progressive movement's history, this did not refer to colonized peoples whose civilizations didn't actually collapse, like people from India or China. This is why, until it was recently replaced with the phrase global majority, the acronym BIPOC was commonly used, standing for Black Indigenous Person of Color. There was a common understanding that indigenous meant something different than just black or person of color. It was its own thing. But in the past few years, the progressives have begun to use the word indigenous a little differently. The requirement that a historical indigenous society has to have collapsed during colonialism has basically been expelled from the word. So, Indian people are indigenous to India, and Chinese people are indigenous to China. Kind of. See, to really understand what's going on here, we have to talk about a couple of other contexts first. If you were to take a European and an American and have them talk about what ethnicity means, you would likely get a lot of confusion. The talk between Sargon and Vosh comes to mind. In an American context, a race basically just refers to a skin color and a broad collection of facial features: white, black, Asian, Hispanic. An ethnicity, meanwhile, is the genetic origin of a person. So a white American might be descended from English settlers, or French, or German, or Russian, and in an American context, their race would be white, and their ethnicity would be, say, English. The reason this is how it works in America, and frankly in most other New World nations as well, is because these are aspirational nations. They are founded specifically on a tradition of immigration. The old cultural practices of the various ethnicities of the immigrants become diluted over multiple generations, and are gradually replaced with a unifying American culture. The only thing that remains are the broad physical markers. And so, English, French, German, Russian all become white. In the old world, though, ethnicity doesn't just refer to genetics. It can also refer to cultural practices, or a historic homeland for a people, or a shared language or language group, sometimes even a religious practice. What all of these have in common, though, is a sense of solidarity among members of the group, a political mythology about where the group came from, what makes them them, and what justifies their unification. A political myth doesn't need to be factually accurate, though it often can be. It simply needs to be a story that a people tell themselves to explain their existence. The American political myth is the Revolution, and its hero is George Washington. The Roman political myth was Romulus and Remus suckling at the wolf mother's teat. It doesn't matter that one story is more factually accurate than the other. Both serve as the founding political myth of their respective groups. From this point of view, practice and belief is just as much a part of ethnicity as genetics is. Let's go back to our examples of India and China. From an American point of view, where citizenship within a country is the identifiable marker of being part of a people, Indians are indigenous to India and the Chinese are indigenous to China. Simple as. But that's not how those people view it. India has roughly 2,000 ethnic groups, divided by language, religious differences, caste differences, and very little of it has to do with skin color, something that defies American expectation. That's why India's modern government is a federal one. A federation is specifically a type of country where partially independent groups are united under a central government in an attempt to represent different peoples and their competing interests. The concept of India as a united polity and the Indian people as a broader ethnicity only came about as a consequence of rejecting British colonial rule. Meanwhile, in China, the dominant ethnicity, the Han, have been engaged in a multi-millennia colonization project of Greater China. This process is called Sinification, where non-Han Chinese are culturally encouraged to adopt Han customs, accept Han political rule, interbreed with Han people, and ultimately become subsumed within the Han ethnicity. This is what is currently happening with the Uyghur genocide. The Uyghurs aren't being slaughtered in concentration camps like the Nazis did with the Jews, but they are undergoing Sinification. Their cultural and religious practices are made illegal. Their men are forced into re-education centers, and their women are being forcibly married off to Han men by the state. The acceptance of the Uyghur genocide as a genocide shows us that the old world concept of ethnicity is still considered the correct one. A genocide is the destruction of an ethnicity, and if an ethnicity is only genetics, as the Americans like to claim, then the Uyghurs aren't actually being genocided. Their genetics will continue to exist within their new Han descendants. But an ethnicity is not just genetics. It is language, religion, cultural practices, a sense of solidarity. Those are what is being destroyed by the Chinese state, and that is why it's a genocide. Now, some particularly sneaky white nationalists will take this understanding and make the claim that civic nationalism is ethnic nationalism, that they are one and the same. Their logic is, if ethnicity is not only genetics, but it's also cultural practices and language and the rest of it, and if civic nationalism is defined as voluntary adoption of a nation-state's cultural principles by immigrants who become citizens and integrate, then civic nationalism must be a form of ethnic nationalism. Ethnic nationalism, in the non-civic sense, is when membership within a nation relies on being a member of the ethnic group that nation rules over, like Germany for Germans or Britain for the British or something. If your ethnic identity is an aspirational one, if you can join it through cultural adoption, regardless of genetics, then there probably is a point to that claim that civic nationalism is a type of ethnic nationalism. However, I will say that nearly everybody that I've encountered personally who seriously makes this claim in public, in private, has no problem with advocating for the mass death or deportation of anybody that they consider to be ethnically undesirable, whether they're citizens or not. Leftoids hear dog whistles everywhere, but in my personal experience, this one seems to ring true. While it's true that civic nationalism is a type of ethnic nationalism, as both terms are defined, all ethnic nationalism is not civic nationalism. When the white nationalists, or hell, the black nationalists too, they're both chomping at the bit to oppress each other, claim that they want an ethno-state, they're not talking about an aspirational ethnicity in the civic integrative sense, and their appealing to civic nationalism is simply a Mott and Bailey. That being said, it is not necessarily the case that all states that are formed around an ethnicity are inherently evil. One can point to Israel and notice the continual displacement and colonization of Palestinians and call that bad, though it is up in the air how much of the crackdown Palestine brings upon itself, considering how much mutual hatred there is in that conflict. But one can also point to Japan, a country with very strict immigration laws, with a population that is 97.8% Japanese, and you will see a very functional state that primarily serves the interest of one ethnicity. Some people will say that Japan isn't actually an ethno-state because non-Japanese people can move there. It's just very difficult. Okay, fair enough. But to me, that's just a word game. You can also call it a nation-state. A nation-state is a political unit where the state and the nation are congruent. It is a more precise concept than a country, since a country doesn't need a predominant ethnic group. A nation, in the sense of a common ethnicity, may include a diaspora that lives outside the nation-state. Okay, this is some of the stuff I went over in my nationalism video. A state is a government that controls an area. A nation is an ethnic group. A nation-state is a government that controls an area that is considered the historic homeland of an ethnic group, and often whose citizens are predominantly members of that group. If you want to call what we're talking about nation-states instead of ethnic states, because the alt-right has made the term ethno-state refer to taking all the non-whites in America and non-violently deporting them somehow because their ideas are retarded, sure, we can go with that. The point that I'm getting at with all of this stuff is, if we accept the following premises: 1. That a nation is an ethnic group. 2. That an ethnicity is not just genetics, but language, culture, religion, all of which form a sense of solidarity among group members. 3. That a political myth is the stories that the group tells itself to justify that solidarity. 4. That ethnicities have historic homelands and have at least some right to see their ethnicity continue into the future on that land, both in terms of genetics and cultural practices. And 5. That disrupting that right using the power of the state to privilege a foreign ethnicity is an immoral act. What you'll find is these 5 premises form the basis of progressive indigenous activism. This checklist applies to Indian rights movements in the United States, Aboriginal movements in Canada and Australia, Palestinian rights in Israel, Uyghurs in China, Indian ethnicities in India, all of the multitude of African ethnicities all across the continent. All of it. The morality underpinning progressive indigenous activism is the same morality that drove the adoption of the framework of the nation-state beginning in the 19th century. It wouldn't be a dev video without Twitter nonsense, so I want to go over parts of this ridiculous thread by an indigenous anarchist witch lesbian twin spirit disabled person. Yeah, disabled in more ways than one. I'm not going to read all of it because it's like 100 fucking posts, but if you want to read the whole thing, here it is, just pause the video. But I want you to keep in mind everything we've talked about so far when it comes to ethnicities and what it means to be indigenous to a location as we go over this. Some of her complaints are reasonable, like where she says that it's racist to say you don't look native enough to be native, or when she brings up blood quantum, which sounds a lot like a white form of signification, so fair enough. Some of her complaints are retarded, like the cultural appropriation shit, complaining about the use of costumes, or white people buying dream catchers, or the casual use of herbs that indigenous people consider to be medicine. And some of her complaints expose the weird, reactionary nature of indigenous activists, spreading the debunked land bridge theory while claiming that indigenous people were also immigrants or also colonizers, so colonization didn't matter. It's unscientific and based in racism. Maybe you should just listen to our communities about our origins and how long we've been here. The land bridge theory is the idea that indigenous people of North and South America, as human beings, ultimately came out of Africa like all of us, and so they got to the Western Hemisphere by crossing a land bridge between Russia and Alaska that existed during the last ice age and vanished when the ice receded. all archaeological evidence, as well as genetic examination of indigenous people in America compared to people living in Eastern Asia, make it highly likely that this is their actual origin. But indigenous activists tend to completely reject this position. As a part of their culture and their spirituality, they believe that they have an origin that is entirely separate from the rest of humanity, that their ethnicity appeared on the earth through entirely different mechanisms than all of the humans of the old world, which is why indigenous activists like this one often call the land bridge theory debunked, and view the claim that they are also immigrants to be racist, because the actual science goes against their political myth, and so disproving that myth is attacking the ethnicity. The funniest part to me is that if you take all the rhetoric these people use and swap the word indigenous for, say, German, you suddenly have the same blood and soil rhetoric used as justification for the atrocities by some of the worst genociders of the 20th century. And not just Hitler's rhetoric on gays and Jews. Mao's rhetoric on landlords and intellectuals. Stalin's rhetoric on Ukrainians and kulaks. It all fits. Now, if I were your average rightoid political pundit, I would make this comparison and end the video. See guys, the indigenous activists are blood and soil Nazis, but because it's for the sake of brown people instead of white people, the left thinks it's okay. While there are absolutely many people on the left who do actually think this simply, who do think this is just okay, we can be a little bit smarter than your average direction brain and keep digging down. What made the monsters of the 20th century monsters is not that they used the same language as the indigenous activists, language designed to separate themselves from the rest of humanity as a distinct ethnic polity with specific rights to an ancestral homeland, meant to reinforce the political myth of their special origins, whether it's the Hyperborean noble-blooded giants for the Nazis or the Great Spirit for the natives. No, it's what those monsters used that language to justify that matters. And I'm under no delusion about what various radical, non-white nationalist groups would do to white people if given the chance. They do want the exact same type of horror. But we also have positive examples of the nation state, where even though the majority of the population is of one ethnicity, where one cultural standard is the normal, visitors are still certainly welcome to come and experience and share that culture for themselves. Immigrants are welcome too, if they integrate and intermarry and become a part of the ethnicity. Not like with China sinification, but voluntarily because it's what they want to do. It doesn't have to be the case that just because a state exists for the primary benefit of one nation, that all other peoples are going to be expelled or exterminated, or that unending war will ravage everything everywhere. To be indigenous in the old world sense means to be the ancestral people of an area that a modern state presides over. And it's not unreasonable for that state to represent those people's interests. That's what a nation state is. So, since all of this is true, and we know that the left accepts it as true based on everything I've told you, the logic as to why sinification of the Uyghurs is bad, the logic behind indigenous activism across the world, all of this stuff, then why is it the case that when it comes to Europe specifically, we instead see this logic? The Sami are the EU's only indigenous people. Since time immemorial, they have lived in an area stretching across parts of 4 countries: Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Russia. This area is called Sapmi. How is it possible that the Sami are Europe's only indigenous people? Are the French not indigenous to France, the Germans to Germany? Are the English, Scots, Welsh, and Irish not the indigenous people of the British Isles? Does indigenous just mean non-white now? The associated pictures show very white-looking Sami people wearing traditional styled clothing, hanging out in the snow with animals. So does indigenous mean savage or living like a barbarian or something? That indigenous activist from before wouldn't like that. Or is it the case that because the status of indigenous confers moral authority among leftoids, the right to a homeland, the right to have special consideration by the state that rules that homeland, the right to the preservation of their culture, and all that other shit that's been stuffed into the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is the reason that the indigenous peoples of Europe are not called indigenous is specifically meant to deprive them of the rights associated with being indigenous to a location? If all the articles within this UN declaration were applied to the indigenous populations of Europe, the progressives would cry racist so hard they would shit themselves. Articles on cultural protection from outside influence. Articles on local control of natural resources and economic activity. Articles on the ethnic makeup of their own institutions. Articles guaranteeing state assistance on ethnic grounds. This is all stuff that every rightoid ethnostater wants for the white ethnostate. Now, this comes from the UN, so it's not a law, but a moral principle. And yet, every single leftoid who thinks that this is a good idea, they would never be caught saying that it is an appropriate moral principle for the indigenous populations of Europe. The question then is, why? Why are the indigenous Europeans not considered indigenous to Europe by progressives? Why are they not indigenous on European land? Is it just anti-white or anti-European racism, like the ethnonats claim? To be fair, that's probably partially it. I know some progressives don't want to admit it, but it's not hard to find various non-white groups who just hate white people, who view members of their own race who have children with whites to be traitors, all sorts of wild shit. Some of this absolutely is just hatred of whites. They might couch it in revenge for colonization, giving them the moral high ground to hate without remorse. But at the bottom of all of it, it's just racism. But I don't think it's only racism. I also think it's part of the march of progress. The nation-state is a 19th century innovation, and a lot of progressives have a very deterministic way of looking at history. This is even more prevalent when you look at socialists, who view history as dividing into clean economic eras, and that a transition from capitalism to socialism is just as inevitable as the transition from feudalism to capitalism. This view, however, is stupid, because history and technological advancement are not predetermined, like filling out a tech tree in a game of Civilization. The current progressive belief is that while nation-states were once useful as a way to shake off the yokes of the old monarchies, the true future, the next step of progress, is found in the Cosmopolitan. No, not the magazine, The Way of Living. Nation-states are backwards and oppressive, erecting artificial barriers preventing cultures and peoples from mixing. This is why so many people on the left have come around to the position that borders are racist, and anything less than unlimited immigration is also racist. Forget about zero immigrants like the conservatives want. If you advocate for 100,000 immigrants a year when you could do 200,000, you're a racist in the eyes of the progs. Why? Because the march of progress means tearing down barriers and hierarchies, and doing away with all tradition, whether or not it's useful. Now that the monarchies are gone, the liberal apparatus of the nation-state is next, because change for the sake of change is the progressive good. This runs much deeper than simple anti-white or anti-European hatred. It's way more complicated than that. Progressives view all cultures mixing into an unidentifiable, gray, universalized, cosmopolitan sludge as an a priori good, because then nobody is excluded or offended by distinctive cultural practices. Standardization is the norm for ease of transport, storage, and sale for pretty much every product. Every modern city looks like a wilderness of brutalist glass and concrete. Entertainment is boring because to risk being different means that someone might not like it, and that narrower appeal means less profits. Progressives know exactly what I'm talking about. When it comes to being an individual, they will say, if you sand off your rough edges, you lose what makes you you. And they say it so much that being a special snowflake became their stereotype. But they were fundamentally correct on some level. The right tends to see this soulless, bland, universalized capitalism that waves a pride flag once a month, emblematic of the modern era, as fundamentally leftist in origin. The leftists don't accept this because it's not real socialism, but the rightists are more sophisticated in their thinking on this topic. A conservative is particular to his culture, his practices, and his aesthetic. None of it is universalized or standardized. A city full of progressives looks like any other city, while a British town, a German town, a Russian town, and a Japanese town look like they are particular to those locations. The fungible economics and politics that progressives spend so much time decrying are caused by and come hand in hand with the universalization of modern culture that progressives demand in order to make things more inclusive. America and Canada are aspirational countries. To be ethnically Canadian simply means to immigrate here and adopt Canadian customs and practices, because Canada's nationalism is civic nationalism. Why would I treat a black Canadian any differently than a white Canadian? We're all Canadian, that's what matters. I'm not going to put my whiteness over my Canadianness, and if he puts his blackness over his Canadianness, he's the problem. Personally, I think this is a good way to run a country. But why does every country need to be like mine? Should every country be aspirational like America and Canada? Are you really British if you get a British passport and citizenship? Or are you just a foreigner who's sticking around? What was your knee-jerk answer to that question in your head? How about this one? Are you really Chinese if you get Chinese citizenship? If your answer to those two questions is different, why? Both Britain and China have indigenous populations that are still around. They're both a type of nation-state that should, if the progressive logic is followed, grant their indigenous ethnicities special consideration. I'm gonna guess that if you're center-left-leaning, because no radical leftoid would ever watch my videos, the logic I presented felt right for Britain, but wrong for China. Why? Why did you knee-jerk Britain as an aspirational country, like the New World countries of America and Canada are, rather than the traditional society that it is? Is it actually because it's white, it's European? Is it because it's English-speaking? Is it because it's a former colonial power? Is it because it's culturally similar to North America in some ways? Is it because it's technologically advanced and militarily capable? Is it because it's one of those countries that is considered to be on top, first world, G7, and therefore it can bear the same short-term economic burden of immigration that other aspirational countries do? I mean, I don't think it can personally. If we look at figures on social welfare spending as compared to immigration in the UK, leftoid cries of just throw more money at it rings hollow, especially if we're talking about the UK's housing crisis. England is already more densely populated than India and Haiti. When conservatives say we're full, there seems to be some truth to that, and crying racism doesn't dispel this fact. My personal position on all of this should be obvious. I'm fine with immigration, probably because I'm from a social contract society. As long as you come here to be Canadian and not ghettoize and colonize, I don't care what race or ethnicity you are. But I also understand that not everywhere is Canada, not everywhere is America. Why should the nations of Europe, who do not have a tradition of immigration like we do, who do not have our space and natural resources, be expected to engage with the world in the same way? Why should every square inch of forest and countryside in Britain, France, Germany be bulldozed and turned into ugly Soviet-style apartment blocks to house new arrivals? We don't demand any other old world nation to place the needs of foreigners above the needs of indigenous ethnic groups, whether they be in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and there does not seem to be any good reason to demand it of European countries. While I have my problems with Sargon's sensible centrism, calling this white nationalism is exceptionally stupid. If this is white nationalist, then Nigeria is a white ethno-state, as Nigeria implements all of these policies. What this actually is the common practices of any non-European nation-state. Progressives don't do much objecting when the rest of the world implements these policies, but they yell and scream something fierce when the right wing of European nations suggests doing it. And it doesn't make me a Nazi or whatever to point out that Europeans are indigenous to Europe, that their countries are nation states, not immigration states. Those who benefit from European states disregarding the will of their own people, namely immigration activists, have no problem pushing narratives that deconstructs the ethnic identity of Europeans, saying that these places and people never truly existed as a polity anyway. This is a line of logic that if it was employed back on them would be blasted by progressives as racist and possibly genocidal. Therefore, there is no reason for us to tolerate it here either. There is definitely a type of leftoid who would listen to this video with their brain completely shut off and come out of it thinking that I'm just a genocidal Nazi who wants to kill non-white people. Those guys are retards, and they're never going to understand anything in here anyway. I didn't say anything racist today. I didn't say anything in here regarding ethnic supremacy, or advocating for mass deportation of a group, or any sort of extermination or racism or whatever. Like I said, I'm from Canada. I'm cool with immigration as long as immigrants come here to be Canadian. I just don't expect nations with indigenous populations that still mostly exist, unlike us, and like European nation states, to do what we do over here. So, what does it actually mean to be indigenous? The rhetoric surrounding indigenous activism demonstrates a glaring flaw in the progressive point of view when it comes to ethnicity. And it's deeper than the whole hashtag landback is blood and soil Nazism, though that's a pretty fun meme to sling around on Twitter sometimes. The real issue here is that there's one progressive value set, the rights of indigenous peoples in their homeland, that is in direct conflict with a second progressive value set, the drive to universalize cultures to include everybody and eradicate racism, distinctions, differences, and hierarchies. The way that progressives have solved this conflict between these two value sets is to de-indigenize Europeans in their own home, a grotesque, dehumanizing act that will likely prove to be terrible for the political stability of those countries going forward. Personally, I'm not surprised that the European voter is turning right-wing after this series of events. And if you ever wondered why I call myself a liberal, but explicitly not a progressive, this racist nonsense is one big reason why.